me start over with that. I see everybody's got their coffee ready. I just wanted to start off with a little breaking news this morning. Bunch of bloggers got together and started a bullshit rumor that there was a coup going on in China. It's a load of horse shit. They printed out some flight maps and, brought up some flight maps and photoshopped out the flights and whatnot, and brought up old footage of an explosion and, trying to say that the military had moved in and yada, yada, yada. Z was under house arrest, and they showed footage of Z with his normal procession of bodyguards, saying that they were arresting him when it's his normal, their equivalent of Secret Service protection. But I guess they wanted to see how far they could get the rumor to spread. But the real story behind it is that the right wing couldn't help themselves. They've been trying to, their cult is at the point where they have to attack our institutions now. They've been attacking the DOJ and the FBI and any institution they can. They've been going after the CIA, and they actually blame this misinformation on the CIA, as if the CIA couldn't do better than a handful of idiot bloggers spreading obvious misinformation. But if there was something bad going on in China, we would be sending our families would be flying out of all our diplomats and staff, and everybody would be flying out of the country as fast as possible. That's not happening. There's nothing going on in China, folks. Nothing worth note, anyways. They've had a COVID problem. They canceled some train tickets, probably because they've got a COVID outbreak in Beijing, but that's just the way they handle it. But keep that in mind as we talk about our subject today, which is, why is it so hard to reach our friends and family members that have gotten tangled up in this Maga cult? And for a point of disclosure, 2 points of disclosure, I'll start with that this is a struggle I face on myself. I have family members that are 100% Maga. And I have been unsuccessful to date in getting through to them. I've got one that we have discussions that he will listen to my point of view, but for the reasons I'll explain later, I'm not going to win him over. I'm just not. The other disclosure I want to make is that when I entered this world, for the first 20 years of my life, I was a Republican. I mean, hardcore. My father was a Republican. And that changed when I got to college. And I know for a fact that's why a lot of right-wingers, including, I'll just go ahead and say it. My eldest son struggles with sending his kids off to college because he doesn't want them to be indoctrinated into liberalhood. And let me just start out by telling you my story, my journey, how I got out of the Republican echo chamber. So I was a pretty sharp kid. I could ace any test at all that you put in front of me. Showed up to my SATs. Here's a little confession. I was a little bit of a wild child too. Showed up to my SATs drunk, and back when I took, they changed the scores on the SATs constantly. Hungover and drunk. A good score was considered 1,200 back then. I scored an 1,150. An excellent score was considered 12 to 1,300. I scored an 1,150, and inebriated with a hangover. So, give you some idea. I was a sharp kid. Got into college, no problem. Showed up at college, and because my dad was a hardcore Republican, that's what made me a hardcore Republican. But like most right wingers, all I could do was really parrot talking points. I didn't have anything beyond that. I just was very polished. And if you put me in a room full of high school kids that were more concerned about the new Duran Duran album coming out, or the new Fine Young Cannibals song that was at the top of the chart, I did pretty damn good. I was pretty smooth. But that doesn't carry you in the real world. Kind of like when you talk to right wingers today, you bat down, you talk to them about a subject, it doesn't go very far for them, and then they just shut down on you. Conversation over. Either they get rude if you don't know them, or if they're family members, they start bringing up Hunter Biden's laptop or some crazy bullshit that you really can't argue about because there's nothing to it. How do you make an argument against a subject that's made up whole cloth, right? All you can do is basically end up doing their version of yelling fake news. So anyways, I'm in college now, and I am taking a writing course, a creative writing class. And this teacher was politically active. This professor was politically active. And you have to envision this. I am uber confident. I'm repeating all the talking points my dad, always programmed me with. And he was not socially Republican. He was militarily Republican, because if you don't know what was going on back in the 80s, the early 80s, Jimmy Carter had a pretty bad rap, even though factually it didn't pan out. Turns out Jimmy Carter had balls like church bells. I mean, it was Jimmy Carter that, not to get off into the weeds, but to give a little credit to old Jimmy. Our special forces, as we know it today, actually, we owe that to Jimmy Carter. He had ordered the attack in Iran that failed so miserably, and it became incredibly obvious that our military needed quick reaction forces that were trained and equipped, and that was all started. All the funding for that, and then the training regimens and everything that sprang out of the Jimmy Carter administration, as well as funding for most of the projects that Reagan claimed credit for. So anyways, back to the subject at hand. There was a strong anti-Jimmy Carter backlash because he appeared weak militarily. And Ronald Reagan draped himself in the military. And my dad was a civilian employee that worked for the military. Don't know exactly what he did because it was classified, but that's he was very. And so I show up to college with a head full of this. I'll just say it what it was. It was garbage talking points that my dad gave me. And I came across this professor. And she, you have to picture it. It's me, 18-ish year old college kid, the head full of talking points, against 40-ish year old worldly experienced college professor with 2 master's degrees. And I was blunt about my politics when we had a conversation in class one day about current events. And she humiliated me. I mean, she wasn't even nice. She just humiliated me. And I was so pissed off. Now, you'd think that, ideally I would say, oh, I learned something. No. That's not what happened. I left that lecture hall, and you have to imagine this was a lecture hall full of kids. I mean, there was laughter involved in how bad she humiliated me. But I left that lecture hall so pissed off. I was going to prove her wrong. I ran straight to the library, and I had jotted down some of what she said. I was so angry. I'm just bright red. I mean, you can see my cheeks turning red right now just thinking about it. This was such a strong memory for me. I ran to the library to prove her wrong. And point by point by point, as I looked up data, real data, she was right. She was right on every damn point. And because I love myself enough not to lie to myself, I accepted it. And it opened my eyes. And I didn't become a Democrat at that point. I mean, once you wear a label, that sticks with you for a while. So I considered myself one of those independents. But for a year or two, but the more I learned, the more I realized the Democratic Party represented what was right in America. They were their, as I like to call it, my brother's keeper party. When to get a little biblical on you, Cain, when God asked Cain, where's your brother? And he said, am I my brother's keeper? Well, Democrats would have answered, yes, I'm my brother's keeper. Let me go find him. It took that for me. But the point of that story is that can't happen today. And the Republicans made sure of it because they've created an entire apparatus of misinformation that, should I have experienced that today, would it be one of your kids or some Republican MAGA freaks' kids? He would have an entire sphere of information that would feed him bullshit to re-establish his viewpoint. The chances of him getting to real information are slim to none because he would have to leave his source bubble. And that's why it is virtually impossible to reach friends and family that are in the MAGA cult. And it goes back to a guy by the name of Lee Atwater. And I'm not going to do a little big, long history lesson, but Lee Atwater figured out that, conservative thought, conservative ideas weren't getting through. And you had a guy by the name of William F. Buckley, who was considered the father of conservatism, who was wrong about everything he ever thought, but at least he approached it from an academic point of view. William F. Buckley wasn't the bad guy in this story. He was just wrong. But people around him that were disciples of his, like Lee Atwater, and Karl Rove was a disciple of Lee Atwater, Newt Gingrich, people like that realized that if they were going to win politically, they had to have their own set of facts. They couldn't live in our reality. They had to have a constant wellspring of bullshit to bury people in order to keep their party alive. They knew their policies were bad for people and that they couldn't sell them at the time. I mean, think about that. Trickle-down economics. You don't need an economics degree to understand the math doesn't work there. You're going to take a uber rich guy and what he saves in taxes, he's going to spend. And because he spends it, after you deduct costs and everything else, that money is going to trickle down and help you. You're talking about a fraction of a fraction of a fraction. It doesn't work mathematically. That's why George Bush, in a moment of honesty, the George Herbert Walker Bush, called it voodoo economics, because it just doesn't work. But because this faction within the Republican Party figured out they needed to be able to sell bullshit, they created an echo chamber. And then along comes Rupert Murdoch with Fox News, who hires one of the guys that created the echo chamber, Roger Ailes. Because Murdoch sees in the country, you've got these conservatives that are Reagan lovers, that are pissed off about Jimmy Carter. They're pissed off about, the gas price situation that happened with the embargo against us. If you're not old enough to remember, you have to look that up. Gas prices shot up and through the roof, and you had some disaffected, unhappy people that were prime to hear bullshit. And that was the beginning of it. Once Fox News was created, you had a place for these people that wanted to hear they were right, that wanted to hear their ideas were right. When a college professor set them straight, I didn't want to hear she was right. I wanted to prove her wrong. So I ran to the library. Had there been this apparatus in place, I'm old enough that it wasn't there, I very likely could have fallen right back into my Republican way of thinking. God forbid that happen. God forbid. I can't imagine what my life would be like, the kind of person I would be like. Because I like being a Democrat. I like being able to say, hey, I want to give everybody health care because that's the right thing to do. I couldn't imagine how that would feel. But to continue on with what we're talking about, why it's so difficult, the bubble didn't start there. It didn't start with just the casual, I want to be Republicans getting told what they wanted to hear. It spread. You had folks like David Duke of the Ku Klux Klan that realized, hey, we can use this. We can use this. You've got a group of people that are just whole cloth making shit up and not apologizing for it. Even when they're called out, they're not apologizing for it. They just scream fake news. So David Duke started bringing in these groups, not just the KKK that he was involved in, but they had their own little news network. They had their own little publications. And they started bringing people into the Republican Party saying, hey, these folks are primed to hear what we have to say. That old Lyndon Baines Johnson quote that if you tell the lowest white man he's better than the highest black man, you don't have to pick his pockets. He'll turn his pockets out for you. That's paraphrasing, but you get the point. The racist, the alt-right was born. The Proud Boys, the seed bed was laid for what we have today with the 3%ers and the Proud Boys and all these racist groups glammed on to what Roger Ailes and Karl Rove and Lee Atwater and Newt Gingrich and all those people were creating. Well, there was another guy that came along, and he decided, well, I'm going to go ahead and bring in the evangelicals into this. This looks like a great idea. The churches didn't used to be anti-abortion. Back in the 60s, the churches did not oppose abortion. I mean, they understood it. They understood it as a medical procedure. They understood it from a medical point of view. And the radicals in the churches, when a guy by the name of Tony Perkins was coming up and was a young man, got into this movement that accepted both white nationalism and the radicalization of the churches. And it was more than just Tony Perkins. You had guys like Brent Bozell, you had groups like Focus on the Family. They were just propaganda generators. Finally, you had them establish this network within the churches where they would actually monetize. They would come up with the best of the best pastors, and they would create these circuits where they would bring in these pastors to local churches that were superstars in the church arena. And it meant a big payday for that pastor. So as long as the pastor in your local church went along, they would send him one of these superstar pastors every now and again and get him a big payday. All he had to do was bill it. And they would fill the church to capacity and beyond, and they would split the pot. They'd split the take, and it would be a big payday for the pastor. It was simple as that, really. So the churches started preaching the political line. And this all happened in the 80s and the early 90s. And then you have the turn of the century, and things started getting out of hand. You had W start a war with no reasoning for it at all. To this day, there's no good reasoning for starting the Iraq War. There isn't. We made Saddam Hussein. He was our guy. There are pictures of Don Rumsfeld shaking hands with Saddam Hussein because we used them to keep Iran in check. We did. We used Iraq militarily to keep Iran in check, and it worked. It worked for a long time. And then they, Saddam screwed up, got out of pocket. We smacked him, rolled up a newspaper and smacked him with the first Gulf invasion, but we left Iraq alone because Bush Sr. understood what Saddam was good for. He was, as awful as he was, in a region that we really had very little influence in. He was our guy. He kept a coalition from forming against Israel. And that's why we never invaded Baghdad in the first Gulf War. We didn't. So you've got this whole culmination of things going on that leads to W. And W, I think he was just stupid enough to fall for Dick Cheney's bullshit. And Dick Cheney saw Iraq as a country with an aging oil infrastructure and an opportunity for Halliburton. And that relationship was strained because of the first Gulf War. You had Saddam Hussein looking to other places. So they reinvaded. And Dick Cheney got what he wanted. And what that has to do with why it's difficult to talk to your family today is you had that echo chamber completely sell a war that was for nothing more than Halliburton contracts. Kellogg Brown and Root was a subsidiary of Halliburton. I mean, there was no other justification for that war. Even the stabilization of oil markets wasn't a justification because Saddam Hussein was selling his oil on the world market. And it worked. And they realized it worked. And they realized if they could sell a war, they could sell anything. I mean, there's an old expression from, I believe it's Voltaire. If you can get a man to believe absurdities, you can get him to commit atrocities. And fast forward that to today. Fast forward that to January 6th. This bubble that they've created makes it impossible for you to go back and talk to them. No matter what you tell them, they can always go back to Breitbart or OANN or, still Fox News, now CNN. And they can get their confirmation that what they believed was true from someone who is slick and well-spoken. It used to be when somebody was in a situation like this, you could approach them. There's actually a method laid out. There's a 10-step method for getting someone a family member out of a cult. Around step 7, it is to slowly start talking objectively about topics. And the reality of those topics would allow you to reach that person. That doesn't work anymore because they're not in reality. They've got an entire atmosphere around them that's based on fiction, pure fiction. And that's why you can't get to your crazy uncle. And that's why I can't get to my son, because no matter how much sense I talk to him, there's always 100 people lined up to confirm his biases. So what's the answer? The answer is power. It's voting. It is diminishing Republican power to the point that it doesn't exist anymore, that it's a third party. It's winning. It's checking your registration, making sure that you're there to vote, and making sure everybody votes. Because the alternative, well, they call Trump King Maga now. And if you don't believe me, check that out. That's their goal. President for life. They want to make Trump president for life. And the only way we stop it, because you can't reach them with conversation or reality, is to muster our forces to the point that we literally destroy the Republican Party. And when their cult has no power, no sway, then and only then will the door be open to you to reach those people. So please, by all means, help me get my message out. Share this with everyone you can. And I apologize, folks. We've gone over. I hate to have gone long, but I appreciate your time. I thank you. Please hit the subscribe button. I need your help getting it out. And every time you hit the subscribe button, although it costs you nothing, it means the world to me. I am trying to hire Americans, editors, digital artists, etc. So please, by all means, hit the subscribe button and support me any way you can. I appreciate you, folks. And you have to vote. Bottom of the ticket to the top. Democrat, and that is the only way you will get those family members back. I hate to say it, but that's it. That's the only way you get them. I love you, folks. This is Old Texas Paul out. Thanks for joining me for another Sunday Coffee. See you next week.